We're gonna do something a little different this week. I don't think we've ever done one of these before, but we're gonna do a model that projects if Alabama played Georgia today, what would it look like? And this is an interesting concept because there's not a lot, because of the SEC being down this year, there's not a lot left on either one of their schedules that could keep them from playing one another. I think for Alabama, it's obviously Auburn, and for Georgia, it's obviously Auburn. So there's a pretty high probability that these two teams are going to play one another, and the matchups are interesting both offensively and defensively, enough to the point that it's worth exploring, and it's our show, so we can do what we want. Let's get into this. Maybe a couple of high-level observations from you, and then, man, let's go straight into the numbers.
Georgia and Alabama both have set themselves up to be the elite teams in the SEC, probably along with Auburn, and I argue along with Texas A&M. Georgia's offensive and defensive numbers sort of differ in that defensively they've been very good on both sides of the ball, and they've been very consistent. Offensively, at times they've dominated with a run, at times they've sort of dominated with the pass, and then a lot of times they've been sort of hot and cold on whether or not the passing game has been a major factor. No, a lot of that has been the injury to Eason. So that makes things a little more difficult to model because Eason's trying to get healthy. Right now, Fromm is the guy. We have a video out there talking about whether Fromm is overrated, but that really the underlying point there wasn't that Fromm was a terrible player or not a terrible player, that Fromm was behind where he should be as a freshman. Our point was more the issue of, okay, we understand he's a freshman quarterback. We understand he's going to get a lot better, but if you play Alabama, they're not going to care that Fromm's a true freshman. How does he stand right now? And when you started breaking into those questions, it's how good is he at the moment? Neither one of us are necessarily sold that Fromm is going to be the guy that ends up starting the rest of the season. We'll get into this a little bit, but I think there's a chance Eason ends up taking over. If that happens, obviously anything remodeling is going to be thrown out the window. Obviously, a lot of stuff's going to change anyway. Guys are going to come back from injury. Guys are going to get hurt. Stuff's going to look different, but we can still sort of project out where things are based on where these teams are. And we kind of know as of right now that both teams are very good with very good defenses, and both of them have offenses that are predicated on the run and use the passing game just to keep you honest.
And this is, just in case somebody's looking back at this a few weeks later, this is heading into week 7. So there's still a lot of football to be played. We still might see a whole lot of things change, but this will be a good touch point to see how well the numbers sort of coalesce in the midpoint of the season versus where they end up at the end of the year. So without telling us what the score is, maybe tell us what you thought going into the score or into the model, running the computer model, in terms of what you've just maybe seen this year from these two teams, and how it differed once you actually ran it.
Right. Well, the thing that I kind of expected to see was that neither one of these teams is going to have a ton of yardage. I expected this to be a projected defensive struggle where it was a low scoring game. And I think the general consensus is what Alabama would probably be coming out on top, right?
I mean, that's what I would say. I mean, just based on, it's not fair to do the whole transitive property thing, but coming off the Georgia Vanderbilt game, just eyeball test, you think that the numbers would support what your eyeballs have seen, but that's not always the case.
And in this case, the model doesn't really back up that narrative much at all. One, it has this as a high-scoring game, and two, and I think most importantly, it favors Georgia.
It's interesting.
So, I'll kind of dig into the model a little bit, and we'll step back because this is a projection, and I think, we are a numbers-driven show, and I would rather talk about the model, see where it projects, and try to explain where the numbers are, where maybe there's some discrepancy, and sort of project how that's going to work out the rest of the season. Both these teams excel in rush defense. Alabama giving up about 69% of opponent averages, Georgia 64. The big difference between the two right now is that Georgia's faced significantly better opponent rushing games. Their opponents are averaging about 5 yards per carry, really with the exception of Vanderbilt that we called last week to be a horrible blowout. Vanderbilt the whole Vanderbilt early season hype is a mirage. Vanderbilt's not a very good team. I do not think they're going to make a bowl. But Alabama's opponents have not been very good in the run game. And up to this point, their numbers have kind of not been great in opponent averages because their opponents are so bad. It's hard to really, it's hard to hold a team less than 2.3 yards per carry, which is what Vanderbilt allows. Alabama hold them to, I think, like point something yards per carry, but it isn't necessarily that great as a percentage. Still, it actually has Georgia a little bit better against the rush. I don't, again, they're really about the same. It's just more a function of Georgia's opponents are better and it's easier for them to show out. Alabama's opponents aren't actually very good, and it's hard for Alabama to distinguish themselves. Even allowing 2.5 yards per carry, it's hard to distinguish versus your opponents. The passing game, it's actually a little bit of the opposite. Alabama's pass defense is rated slightly worse, 80% of opponent averages. Georgia's averaging allowing 78% of opponent averages. So pretty similar. Alabama a little behind. The difference there is Georgia has played particularly bad passing teams. The best passing team in a per play average sense that they've played is Vanderbilt at 6.8 yards per attempt. Beyond that, the best team they faced is a three-way tie between Appalachian State, Notre Dame, and Tennessee. All three of those teams only average versus FBS opponents 5.7 yards per attempt. That means all three, and it's bizarre, by the way, that they're all three 5.7 because they are three of five teams in a five-way tie for 112th nationally in yard per attempt average. So really their slate they've played, and I should throw out Mississippi State is even worse at 5.1 yards per attempt. Mississippi State's actually 122nd nationally in yards per attempt average.
That's not good.
No, Georgia has played an almost uniquely bad slate of passing offenses to this point in the year. Anytime you see Vanderbilt, who by the way, Vanderbilt themselves is 83rd nationally as by far the best passing offense you faced. That's a bad sign. Alabama, not all that much better, but they've played. Colorado State's actually one of the better passing attacks nationally. Believe it or not, Stevens is probably an NFL quarterback. They're 16th. Ole Miss may have a lot of issues, but they're still 25th in the nation in passing. And even A&M, as weak as they are, is a better passing team statistically than anyone Georgia's faced. So it's kind of hard to deal with these numbers because Alabama averages allowing 5.8 yards per attempt, but the opponents are a lot better. And Georgia only allows 4.5 yards per attempt, but it's 4.5 allowed out of a 5.8 yard per attempt average. So I think both these passing offenses are probably a little better than their numbers. They just kind of Alabama's is hampered because their opponents aren't great. Georgia's is a real question mark because frankly their opponents are terrible. They haven't faced a real passing attack yet.
Yeah, and Georgia's got kind of a double-edged sword here. Like, their per average numbers look great, but they don't get the opportunity, like you said, because frankly their opponents are approaching zero. So there's this question mark of, oh, you haven't played any good quarterbacks. You haven't played any good pass offenses. So who are you? But then they're like, well, you can't do better than zero, and we're doing barely better than zero. So that's still pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, you're allowing 4.5 yards per attempt. Like, there's nothing shameful about that, no matter how bad the opponents are. The problem is, much like Alabama's run defense, we don't know how good Georgia's pass defense is or isn't. And we kind of flagged this with Auburn last week with Ole Miss and saying we kind of want to see are they actual real or they're a mirage because their opponents were so bad. There was a little bit of sign that maybe Auburn's pass defense isn't quite what it's cracked up to be. I think Georgia's is probably more what it's cracked up to be, but we have the same problem. On paper, there's not a lot to go by. They were able to disrupt offenses that are very easy to disrupt. And mainly, defensively too. I'll go back and step back a little bit that when we talk about these statistical mirages, Notre Dame gave 5.7 yard per attempt average, but you look at their rushing average, and Notre Dame's rush average is buoyed by the fact that they ran for 515 yards against Temple, a 10.1 yard per carry average on 51 attempts. And that was Boston College. Against Temple, they ran 44 times for a 9.6 yard per carry attempt, 422 yards. And so then Miami of Ohio, 40 carries, 330 yards, 8.5 yards per attempt. When Notre Dame's played decent teams, Georgia held them to 1.5 yards per carry, but Michigan State held them to 4.5. North Carolina held them under 6 yards per carry. I don't know where Notre Dame's at. They're all over the place. They've played really terrible teams and run for 1,000,000 yards a carry. They've played probably bad to average teams like Michigan State, and they're 4.5 ish. And Georgia completely shut them down. So there's so many questions really where Georgia should be placed. And I'm not saying that makes them bad. We don't know. They could be unstoppably good, and they could be a little bit more deficient. We just don't know because they haven't had the opportunity to really prove themselves.
I will say though, in Georgia's favor, we have seen some of these other teams face not terrible but not good defenses to know what that looks like. So like a John Kelly at Tennessee ran all over a Florida defense that neither one of us thinks is good, but they're not like bottom of the barrel, worst in the country kind of bad. So the fact that Georgia was able to bottle him up is a good sign, I think. Let's talk about this a little bit, and then I really do want to get into the numbers. There are, I think, still a lot of unknowns, but really for both of these teams. But Georgia has, in my opinion, a schedule to this point that tells us, you're winning all these games, but you should win all these games. Alabama's a lot of the same thing, but we've got a 10-year history on Alabama being an elite team to know that when they beat somebody 66-0, they're really good. So I don't think there's a question mark of whether or not Alabama is an elite team, but I think we're getting to the point where we can't help but say that Georgia is probably at worst an elite minus team, but very much a threat to this Alabama team. And the reason I say this is real long-winded, but the reason I say this is if you look at the teams who have beaten Alabama in the past, one kind of common thread with most of them is a lot of them, and I point out 2014 Ohio State to be this example, a lot of them beat the ever-loving crap out of the teams that they're better than. And Georgia is doing that to this point this year, except for a tough game, first start on the road at Notre Dame. They're doing that thing that teams who beat Alabama have to be able to do. You don't see Alabama losing to teams who struggle with a bunch of middling teams. So 2014 Ohio State is a perfect example of this. Besides the Virginia Tech game that they lost, they had a bunch of trash. I think they had one ranked team. Their first ranked team was like November 11th or something like that. It was opened up with just garbage, but they blew all that garbage out of the water, blew Wisconsin out in the conference championship game, and I see a lot of that in Georgia. So tell me, is there something there with the way they're handling business, or do we still not know anything about Georgia at this point?
I think there is something there, right? And it's it's confirmation in the sense that it's not a red flag to show a problem. There is nothing on paper right now to really indicate that Georgia isn't for real, especially defensively, where they've been able to dominate games. The one thing I think when you look at these games, the one thing that's a red flag is the fact that as a passer, Jake Fromm has been very hot and cold. And I'm not going to spend an eternity on this because we had that whole video on if Jake Fromm's overrated. I think a lot of people overreacted on this, but we kind of did that video knowing we were going to start looking into this like Alabama Georgia matchup and where Alabama and Georgia would compare. It's a whole other level of bar. And Alabama doesn't care that Fromm is a true freshman and that he's going to improve. Alabama cares about how good he is today in the same way that Clemson didn't care that Jalen Hurts was a freshman in the national championship game. It's a different level when you're talking about the playoff. Jake Fromm has really high yard per attempt averages, 8.8 yard per attempt, because against Samford, against Mississippi State, he's 12.7 yards per attempt. He's 16.8 yards per attempt. But when he played Notre Dame, it was 4.9. When he played Tennessee, it was 5.6. And I know he went back up against last week against Vanderbilt. We've already established, as we've said for several weeks, Vanderbilt is a straight up bad team on both sides of the football. So I do think there's a little bit there with Georgia that as much as they're winning on the scoreboard, there are signs in the passing game that there may be question marks. And to me, it's extremely similar to the way Alabama was last year, where there were a lot of games that they would win close. I remember there was an FCS team they played late where they couldn't throw the ball very well at all. And they basically had to run it and go back to the regular offense to put up enough scores to win comfortably. There's a little bit there with Georgia, I think. And that's something that they have plenty of time to iron out. And Georgia has the huge advantage that Fromm as a true freshman that's playing probably as a temporary backup. And if it really is an issue, they can pull him. But beyond that, defensively, I see no issues. They've done exactly what an elite team should do against bad teams. The whole problem is really when you play a better team and you have these things that look like minor issues or minor inconsistencies, they can get exposed because you just deal with things in a different way. And I think the big example we've talked about a lot this year is we've really dinged Clemson because we're not totally sold on their back seven. Their front four has been so good that they've dominated teams by getting in the backfield and disrupting and generating negative plays with tackles and sacks. But it's kind of hidden the fact that when teams were able to throw, they've actually thrown for pretty good yardage and high yard per attempt totals in Clemson. So that begs this question of Clemson is probably going to blow out everybody on their schedule for the rest of the year. But if they have a game where the other team's offensive line can hold up and they can throw the ball, how will they do? And much more importantly, if they get in the playoff and they play, an Oklahoma or an Oklahoma State that throws the ball all around the yard, or they play a Sam Darnold that can evade pressure and can make plays down the field, how are they going to hold up in that scenario? And those are the kinds of things we're poking holes at with Georgia right now.
All right, so let's. I mean, we can talk a little bit about what we see in the numbers, but let's talk about what the computer model predicted if these two teams played today. Predicted the score to be, and then we'll kind of get into that.
Right. So the prediction from the model is, and I got to go to a decimal point here. Georgia 27.6, Alabama 27.1. So brutally close. It has Alabama in a per play sense actually outgaining Georgia 5.1 yards to 5 yards. It has neither team able to run the ball very well. Alabama 4.1 yards per carry, Georgia 3.9 yards per carry. It has Alabama with a little over 6 yards per pass, Georgia with 6. Both of them 6.1 yards per attempt. So almost mirror images, the run and the pass. Both these teams that are dominant run teams, both are expected to stagnate against the opposing run defense. And you end up with a score that ever so slightly favors Georgia, and it rounds to Georgia 28, Alabama 27. But if you remember back to that 2012 Alabama Georgia game, it was Alabama 32, Georgia 28. And everything right here, this prediction from the model, the statistics, it's saying it's the same sort of margin, same sort of scoring, similar points game. We're kind of grinding, weird game early where there was a lot of special team scores. And basically, the teams just got tired late, and Alabama was able to finally pull away with their run game. But even still, Georgia threatened at the very end. And that's kind of exactly what you're looking at statistically.
And I think what's interesting, you touch on the run game, is if these two teams matched up, you have a situation where you'll know for sure whether or not those run defenses are a mirage or not, because I don't know that there's a team in the country that has a better or deeper running back group than either Alabama or Georgia. You think that's fair to say?
I think that's fair to say for both teams.
All right, so your initial thoughts. You see a score from a model. Generally, we go in line with the model. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of data at this point. We don't know if these teams are even going to play each other, but it's a fun discussion. What are your initial thoughts on, is the model completely crazy, or is there something there and you could see it playing out like that?
My initial thought is that it makes a lot of sense. I think to a certain extent, Alabama is still being disfavored in the model because their run defense hasn't had a chance to prove itself much. And as we said, things like Notre Dame has a 6.9 yard per carry average on the season. That gives Georgia a chance to really show that their defense is very good in a per play sense because they held Notre Dame to a fairly low average. But Alabama's opponents up to A&M weren't good enough for their rush defense to really prove itself. Because even if you hold the team to their average, you hold Vanderbilt to Vanderbilt's season average, you held them to 2.3 yards per carry. And it's just hard to hold teams to much less than that just because, eventually they hit the line of scrimmage and you could quarterback sneak for a yard and a half, even if you're a terrible team on first down. And most defenses are more than happy to let you do that. So, yeah, I think it does make sense, but I also think we're going to need a lot more data. And I think the interesting thing is there are a lot of signs we may not get a whole lot more data. right as it stands today, the only ranked team on both schedules is Auburn. It's the only remaining ranked team. The SEC really and truly is down. I think Alabama and Georgia are elite teams, but this reminds me a lot of what the Big Ten looked like last year. And we did a whole lot of videos on this that we couldn't tell you how good Michigan and Ohio State was or Wisconsin statistically because we know, maybe that Michigan lost at Ohio State, and we know that Michigan and Ohio State were better than a lot of really bad teams, but that doesn't tell you a whole lot. There was no context. And Alabama and Georgia have a similar issue. Alabama does have the win over Florida State in what was kind of a closer win than a score in certain ways, but also, again, Alabama kind of went in turtle and protected the lead. Georgia, we said at the time that was a close win against Notre Dame in big late. I really felt like that game was closer to being blown out by Georgia than it was lost by Georgia. I felt like they were played a sloppy early season game, and I felt like they were clearly the better team. So I think we do have some sort of data point to say that both these teams are actually pretty good on a national level. But I also think the only real point of comparison we're going to have for both of them is going to be the common opponent of Auburn late in the year. And all we're going to know at that point is between Auburn, Alabama, and Georgia, kind of who's relative to who. But again, I just don't think we're going to know a whole lot. I think there's a very good chance we're going to see these two in the SEC championship game. And I think it's really exciting because really both these teams are probably going to run the table. Both of them are probably going to blow out most of the opponents for the rest of the year. And we're going to go into that game without knowing a whole lot about who these teams are outside that one random common opponent in Auburn and however they do in that game. And that one's going to be hyper analyzed, probably unfairly, to determine who's going to win it.
I think, and based on what we saw Alabama and A&M this past weekend, I think there's something to Georgia's defense being able to slow down Alabama a little bit, especially if Jalen Hurts has maybe some of the passing, worries that he had from last year, which we both think he's improved. We did see some things we didn't love against A&M. On the flip side, though, Alabama has a 10-year history of not getting run on at all. I mean, Leonard Fournette, Geis, last weekend, Keith Ford and Trey Williams, I think they went 1.7 and 2.5 yards per carry, respectively. Nobody ever runs on Alabama. So that, to say that Georgia wouldn't run on Alabama is probably, it's not going too far out into the crazy land. So that's putting it to, at that point, Jake Fromm or Eason having to win the game, and I don't know how that would play out. The good thing for Georgia is that whoever is the starter at the end of the year has a bunch more football to get better than they already are. So neither one of us are going to make a prediction on this game because, like I said, we don't know that either one will play. But here's the question I want to end on. At this point in the season, how confident are you that if these two teams played in the SEC championship game, it's basically a de facto national title game like it was when they played in 2012?
At this point, I think it's probably more likely than not. And I don't know. I think it's probably more true, honestly, for Georgia than Alabama. Clemson is, for lack of a better word, something of a one-trick pony this year. They're dominant on the defensive line, truly dominant. Their starting defensive line, it may be the best we've seen in college football in 10 years. And Alabama's had a lot of great lines that had tremendous depth, but the starters on that Clemson defensive line this year are absolute freak elite. And Georgia, I think, is a little more balanced in that regard. I think the offensive line may be a little more able to deal with it, and they're more of a traditional passing team where they can compensate in ways that I think Alabama can't. But I do think both these teams are probably better than Clemson. And, I think it really comes down to it's really just going to be the Alabama Georgia winner and probably Clemson out of the ACC. And, while it may be not be a de facto national title in the same sense that Alabama was able to walk into a buzzsaw or walk in and buzzsaw a Notre Dame team that both of us said at that time years ago before we were doing this stuff, and I was still doing this model way back when. The same model had Alabama destroying Notre Dame, and that's actually kind of where I got my start on the whole blogging scene. Clemson's not that kind of team. They're not going to blow them out that way. But honestly, just about anybody else, they probably would.
Yeah, I agree. I think if there's one team right now that poses a threat to Alabama or Georgia if they played, and we're leaving Auburn out right now, and that's not really fair, but this is just a fun situation because you got an East and West. I think the only other team that makes sense right now is Clemson, and Kelly Bryant's got some time to get better too. But honestly, Oklahoma's probably going to win the Big 12. We saw what the Pac-12 had last year, and I don't know what's going on in the Big Ten. So that's a fun conversation. We're going to do some more of these because it's our model. We can put any two teams in it we want. So look for a little bit more on that. That's it for us this week, y'all. I'd like some feedback on maybe some teams that you'd like for us to put in the model that might play later in the year. Tell us what you think the score of Alabama-Georgia would be if they played today. If you didn't like this video, give us a thumbs down, but give us a comment. If you liked it, give us a like. If you loved it, we'd love a subscribe. Thanks so much, y'all. God bless. Have a great week.